Good afternoon, everyone. Not all quiet all of a sudden. That's the helpful signal to begin. My name is Melinda Lowry. I'm director of the Center for the Study of the American South here at UNC, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second James A. and Marguerite P. Hutchins conversation of 2018. Our guests are Jason Oliver Chang and Jennifer Ho, who you'll hear more about and from in a minute. But I want to thank our many co-sponsors for this event, especially the Carolina Asia Center, but there have been so many others. Pat Horn, our associate director at CSAS, has been absolutely instrumental in bringing all of this together in an amazing way. And we're very grateful for those sponsors, and we're also grateful for the family that this Hutchins event is named after. And so I just want to tell you a word or two about them. James Hutchins was an alumni of Carolina who spent most of his life fighting world hunger, living all around the world. And his wife Margaret were great, he and his wife Margaret were great friends and supporters of the center. After studying Southern Studies at UNC back in the 1930s, he served in the Navy. He spent his career in the Department of Agriculture, coordinating food aid for the direct distribution branch in over 84 countries. And so in the spirit of kind of his international work, we're very pleased to bring together a Global South conversation today, and specifically think about the ways in which unexpected topics converge as we think about the region and the way the region has expanded and contracted over many, many years. So Jason and Jennifer are going to share that with us today. And so this year, in the past, some of you might know that the Hutchins lectures have been single scholars delivering lectures. This year we've kind of reformatted them somewhat as conversations. So Jennifer will be our kind of interlocutor, and Jason is our guest, basically. And we do this in the spirit of the Hutchins family's desire to connect Southern Studies at UNC with critical issues that are facing the contemporary South. And the best way to engage that, we believe, is through conversations. So thank you, Jennifer and Jason, and I'll take it away.
So welcome, everyone. It's so great to see such a robust crowd today. And of course, please make sure that you hydrate and eat snacks, which are out in the lobby. Yeah. Oh yeah, and so I'm going to be live tweeting when possible, but of course during the conversation portion it would be rude for me to try and tweet and have a conversation at the same time. But for those people, show of hands, who has a Twitter account or who tweets? Oh, I thought this would be more popular among the students. So if you do tweet, we would really like you to tag CSAS, which I don't.
It's UNC South, but we're also interested in you tagging Jason's account, which is Chinotronic.
Which is a great handle. Yeah.
Tronic. So anyway, we'll look for that if you happen to be on Twitter, but I'll be sending out some reflections as we go on.
Great. And I will retweet under @DrJenHo. So I wear many hats. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jennifer Ho. I am a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, where my research interests are in Asian American studies. This is how I got to know our esteemed guest today. I am the associate director of the Institute for Arts and Humanities, and you are in Hyde Hall, which is the home of the IAH. But the other hat I wear is that I am on the faculty board for the Center of the Study of the American South, and I'm very pleased to wear that hat, particularly because I think that an understanding of the U.S. South is really changing, and I want to really compliment the staff and especially the leadership under Melinda for really thinking about new ways to consider what it means to be in the U.S. South and the relationship of the U.S. South to the global South, and that's part of what Jason and I will be talking about today. So I asked for and received the honor of introducing him. So Jason Oliver Chang is an assistant professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut Storrs campus. At UConn, he is an affiliated faculty member with the Maritime Studies Institute, as well as the Institute for Latinx, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies. And he also serves as the associate director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. So, you know, just a few things going on campus. In 2010, Jason earned his PhD in comparative ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley campus. He is the author of Chino, Anti-Chinese Racism in Mexico, 1880 to 1940, with the University of Illinois Press, and co-author of Asian America, a primary source reader, Yale University Press. He has published articles in the Journal for Asian American Studies, the Pacific Historical Review, and the Journal of Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures in the Americas. Jason's current work rewrites Asian American history from the perspective of Chinese, South Asian, and Filipino sailors to think of how racial formations work at sea. And just as a personal note, I want to say what a real pleasure it is to have Jason here. We were actually talking earlier because I actually can't remember a time when we first met. I just know that I've known Jason for a very long time, have been really privileged to call him a friend. I also saw a presentation, do you remember this, in San Francisco in its nascent stage. And so it was such a delight to read Chino in book form. I actually read it on my Kindle, but still, as a book. And so please give a warm welcome to Jason Oliver Chang.
Wow, thank you. That was so generous. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to join you guys here. And also a challenge to try and summarize the last 10 years of research and writing in 10 minutes. But first, I just want to thank you and Professor Pat Horn for the amazing invitation to join you guys here. And this is my first time in North Carolina, so I'm a little sad that I can just be here for today. But I'm excited to share this work with you and have this conversation. So what I'm going to try and do here is give you guys a sense of the main questions and the main questions I address in Chino by way of highlighting the methodological and interpretive challenges I encountered in writing the book. And I think this will dovetail nicely with our conversation. And I've included some cool images and pictures that we can come back to that we can hopefully dwell on those in the course of our discussion. So in the book, I address a key question. Why did anti-Chinese politics become popular in Mexico? And I show how racism was a powerful force in the turbulent years of modernization, revolution, and reconstruction in the early 20th century. And in this book, I focus on the ideological construct of the Chinese racial figure, or the imagined Chino, and its place in Mexican culture and politics. So this book isn't about Chinese Mexicans, right, or the formation of their community. This is a book about how anti-Chinese racism facilitated a nationalistic public sphere in the regeneration of the Mexican state after the revolution. And so by looking at the public sphere, I'm able to kind of show how the post-revolutionary state was redefined as a mestizo racial state. So what I mean by racial state is a government founded upon and sustained through the creation and maintenance of racial subordination. And I illustrate how anti-Chinismo, or Mexican anti-Chinese politics, was special by showing how it was effective and compelling in ways that solved pressing political problems from the 1880s to 1940. In the end, the racial imaginary fostered by anti-Chinistas in Mexico helped invent mestizo nationalism and make it popular without challenging the political elites. The term mestizo is derived from the colonial period of Mexico and later came to refer to a loose social category that encompassed people who were perceived to have a mixed European and indigenous heritage. And many have argued that anti-Chinese politics in Mexico was mere xenophobia, derived from the exclusive boundaries of Mestizo nationalism. But if you know your Mexican history, you will also know no one thought Mexico was a Mestizo nation before the revolution. And rather, I propose that Mestizo nationalism became hegemonic in Mexico through the help of Chinese racialization. So it sounds a little complicated, a little counterintuitive, but I'm going to walk us through that argument. And so what was interesting about this is that I mapped this relationship onto the crises of the Mexican state, right, during the 1910 revolution, shifting to meet the needs of a rapidly evolving state apparatus. The image of the Chinese transformed from disposable laborers to killable subjects, and then again to pernicious defilers. And ultimately, the Chinese racial form justified to a divided republic the necessity and popularity of a fascist state power, of an authoritarian regime based on the obligation to protect and strengthen an invented Mestizo nation. So as a PhD student, I began a project about a Chinese community at the Mexicali-Calexco border, and over here the California and Baja California peninsula. And both borderlands, when I was writing this, I was researching this topic, both borderlands history and Asian American history were overshadowed by attention to the US. And the history of Asian migration to North America was oriented by the narratives of the gold rush, economic recession, white labor agitation, persecution, and the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1882. And similarly, borderlands history was driven by narratives of US imperialism and conquering land and taking the northern half of Mexico, as shown in this image, in this map. But I struggled to find the place for Chinese Mexicans and the expressions of anti-Chinese politics in Mexico within those narrative arcs. Right? So within that received literature, it appeared that Mexico was a second choice destination. Right? Maybe they had preferred to go to the US, but because of exclusion acts ended up in Mexico. Or that Mexicans borrowed US stereotypes and their expressions of anti-Chinese politics. And also that the border was dictated by US industrialists, right? That Mexicans had little agency in structuring their side of the border. But my research in the archives around Mexico didn't match with these stories, right? I had to leave US conceptually behind. And so as they say, we had to decenter the United States in the study of the border and of Mexico. So rather than find a place for Mexico's Chinese population and the expressions of anti-Chinese politics within the historiography of the US, I chose to use my training in ethnic studies in a different way. I wanted to take Asian American studies outside of the US. But there's two problems. A, I run the risk of exporting US understandings of race and power. And B, I also run the risk of diluting the scholarly attention to Asian American studies. So the practice of thinking about race transnationally has a lot of pitfalls. And so I've meditated on this question a lot. So for me, centering Mexico also meant confronting another historiography which had become accustomed to erasing the Chinese presence. But yet I saw signs of the influence and presence of Chinese in Mexico hidden in plain sight. In my own process of trying to identify what is the core transportable concerns of Asian American studies, I kept coming back to this question: what is the political function of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism? Few Mexicanists had ever considered this question. So going back to source material, well-worn source material over the Mexican Revolution, one of the most researched revolutions, this question hadn't been asked, right? I had to think carefully how I wanted to take this question from Asian American studies, apply it to a different kind of space. So in doing so, I kind of developed an analytical rubric, right? A way of thinking about race in a different space. So in recalibrating Asian American studies to the Mexican context, I wanted to ask how were anti-Chinese politics connected to big questions in Mexico like citizenship, sovereignty, revolution, and nationalism, right? So even though Mexican anti-Chinismo shares some anxieties with the United States anti-Chinese movement, the similarities are limited. They may share some of the similar discourses and tropes about racial threats and fears, but how they made sense differed significantly. So to argue that Mexicans appropriated US Orientalism dislodges and isolates the discursive production of racial difference in Mexico from the material and cultural conditions from which it emerged, and also blurs this definition of Orientalism that I think we'll be able to discuss in our conversation. So for me, it was vital to draw attention to differences between Anglo and Spanish settler colonialism. Right? So on the one hand, Anglo societies practiced extermination of the indigenous community, where the Spanish colonization wasn't altogether friendly to begin with, but they also incorporated indigenous populations into their political structure. And this made a significant difference in the majority population. Who was being governed is a big question, right? So the incorporation of the indigenous population and a lack of a mass replacement population like exists in Anglo settler societies was a significant concern. Also, because of the majority indigenous population, there's also a need to account for different sources of legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty over this territory. And because of these different governing structures, it was important to also identify that the state apparatuses that are creating these racial formations are also altogether different, right? The Mexican state was completely destroyed during the revolution. A new constitution was written and the new government created, right? There's no parallel time period for that consideration in the United States. So this was a severe kind of crisis of legitimacy and authority for state actors, and I wanted to recognize that difference. And there were also legal differences, legal traditions that were different in claiming liberal modern statehood, and so this translates to the absence of Jim Crow style laws in Mexico. So we can't use those standards of a racial state to evaluate the race relations of another space, right? So these were some of the considerations I had in comparing the United States and Mexico and thinking, what parts of Asian American studies can travel, right? So as I got further into this project, I had to kind of think deeply about the structure of Mexico and the place of the Chinese diaspora. So I think of these two maps as kind of related. My work is situated at the overlap of these two maps. So the top one looks at the concentration of the Chinese immigrant population in 1910, and the second one is the ethno-linguistic geography of indigenous groups in Mexico, right? So basic takeaway from here is that while the Chinese diaspora has a certain pattern, those folks are in places with distinctly different Mexican populations, right? That don't have the same relationship to the central state, who maybe don't even identify as Mexican, right? So I wanted to accommodate the levels of complexity, right, that represented here, and the need to recognize the historical specificity and the development of anti-Chinese politics in different places, right? So for me, the major takeaway here was that people became anti-Chinistas for different reasons, right? So Mexicans in Colima connected anti-Chinese politics to the anti-Catholic war. In the north, Chinese in Baja were connected to land reforms, right? Whereas in Tamaulipas in the east, anti-Chinese politics was connected to labor struggles. Whereas in the Yucatan, Chinese were a part of Mayan plantation labor. And so we get really different pictures of what kind of Mexico that Chinese diaspora was encountering, right? So that is a signal to us that the ways that racism develops have to also be equally textured. So taking these ideas to guide my research, the story emerging from the archives was not of Mexicans borrowing American stereotypes or kicking the Chinese out because they weren't mestizo, right? It was far more dynamic and driven by the central crises of the Mexican state. There are examples of, these are the examples of the types of images, discourses, and racialized figures I encountered in my research. In trying to make sense of these, I came to see how anti-Chinismo shifted along with the changing conditions of Mexico's so-called Indian problem, right? So for 30 years, Mexico was ruled by a dictator leading up to the 1910 revolution. And under that period, Indians were considered to be unreliable agents of modernization. And many elites in Mexico imagined that they could be just as wealthy as the Europeans if they could just have a different populace, right? So in place of that, Chinese workers were brought in to leapfrog their infrastructure development, to build railroads, aqueducts, other infrastructure projects that would help the country modernize despite their perceived deficit in racial stock, right? And the revolution was the collapse of this state, right? And and a recognition then that there were very few ideas that could unify Mexico in this condition. And so the images of indigenous people and the mass populace of Mexico came more as subjects of discontent, right? These were factional groups constantly vying for power and control of the state. And in that space, the Chinese represented they represented the old regime, right? They were brought in as replacements, right? And so killing them was a way of imagining this new Mexico, right? So it had nothing to do with mestizo identity, right? But not until Reconstruction do we get expressions of the vulnerability and promise of the indigenous population. And the counterpoint to that is this idea of the Chinese as pernicious defilers, right? And so this helps to build consent for broader state action. Yeah. Oh, it's time. Okay, cool. So let me just end here with a summary of anti-Chinismo, right? This is a summary of how I've connected these different elements, right, in the research, and how it helped me to come away with a different story about Mexican nationalism, right? So we can continue the conversation from there.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome.
Great.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so I only have my phone, it's off, don't worry, or it's muted, so I can keep track of time, because we want to make sure that we, of course, allow questions from the audience. So the first question for you is, can you talk, so you showed us a slide about this hemispheric turn,
Yeah.
and in your book, you talk about this hemispheric turn that you make in Chino and its connection to transnationalism. So because you are invited here from the auspices of the Center for the Study of the American South, and Melinda gave such a great introduction contextualizing what, putting the U.S. South together with the Global South. So can we unpack these terms? So what does the term Global South mean to you? And then how would you situate Chino within that?
Yeah, so the hemispheric turn in Asian American studies really comes from this a larger trend in transnational history, right, which is a recognition or the use of archives from many different places, right, and so while the study of diaspora was in some ways an impetus to study both the homeland and the destination, there became a new recognition that there were multiple destinations, right, that we could evaluate, and so the hemispheric turn in Asian American studies was a way of recognizing these various routes, and by doing that, by recognizing these other patterns, we also see that the historical periodization of the diaspora itself has also changed, right? If we're paying attention to the trans-Pacific movements, then we're also looking at the Spanish Empire and the construction of the galleon trade, the invention of globalization, and so these methodological shifts help to define these new boundaries for Asian American studies, and I think in a similar way, looking at the Global South is a way of recognizing these deep patterns of history, right? So to think about like Wallerstein's idea of the capitalist world system as an enduring political economic structure for globalization. That his basic idea was that there is a core part of the globe that concentrates wealth and exerts power and influence over the peripheral areas of the world in which resources and wealth are extracted from. And so when I think about the Global South, I'm also aware of the way that while it's a space of domination, it also practices racial domination itself, but under different circumstances, right? So the Global South is a place of volatility because of its exploitation by the core, but it also gains stability by aspiring to those same values, those same standards of modernity and the construction of their own racial states. And so for me, the Global South is also this kind of, a recognition of a geographical global hierarchy, but then also that race functions in a different way in the periphery than it does in the core, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so would you say your work is in dialogue at all with the U.S. South? Or I guess how can we think about the work you're doing kind of concentrated in Mexico,
Right.
which I think we can easily see
Yeah.
as part of the Global South in conversation
Yeah.
with the concerns that the U.S. South.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question because, when I think of the South, I'm placing it in the context of slave societies, plantation societies, and it's also an interesting parallel that, on the one hand, so in the context of the Civil War, the South lost the Civil War, but then in a way sort of won Reconstruction. And that was an interesting way to read, say, like the independence of Mexico from Spain, right? They claim, they outlaw slavery in 1824, the first independence, the first colonial independence that abolishes slavery, but yet continue to practice it. And so I think there's these interesting parallels between the South and these other sites in the Global South that are dealing with being peripheral, right? And so I mean, there's also all these connections between the Yucatan, which practices henequen plantation, where they use Yaqui slave labor from the north. So rebellious Indians from the north were gathered up and enslaved in the Yucatan to work in plantations, many of which fed on and were connected to southern plantation owners. And so, you know, I find this interesting connection there for a place that kind of pioneered chattel and commodity agriculture and exported it to these different places in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And then by the 19th century, all these other places that grew out of the Southern experience began to experiment with coolie labor, right? And the use of contracted Asian workers to replace enslaved Africans. But yet the South never, you know, the place where that plantation system kind of came into, was formulated, they never practiced that kind of that racial substitution. And so that.
Well, I think they might have tried.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
there was an experiment of bringing Chinese coolies into the U.S. South at the end of the Civil War, but it was a failed experiment.
Yes.
It never, which is an interesting question. Why it failed in the U.S. South when coolie labor and indentured labor was used all throughout the Caribbean. Right. Yeah. Which actually brings me to my next question, which is, can we talk about Orientalism?
Yeah.
So Orientalism is an organizing rubric
to
think about global ethnic studies, and certainly the questions in your book related to Chinese in Mexico.
Right.
And anti-Chinismo. So I guess the first thing is maybe explaining to our audience what Orientalism is, and then how that relates to the organizing rubric in your book.
Yeah, so my understanding of Orientalism comes from Edward Said as a foundational figure, and his book Orientalism it basically gave us this a detailed deconstruction of Western imperialism, but as a cultural project that facilitated a military industrial process, right? So the part that was really innovative about his analysis was it showed how dominating another place, another culture, also involves the construction of that culture. So for instance, British scholars would write tomes about places they'd never been, right? In order to build up an idea of what this place was, and that served as justification and rationale for taking military forms of intervention and self-serving ideas of another culture and place that rationalized entitlement and colonization. And so that, to me, was is like a key theory in Asian American studies, right? To understand imperialism itself, right? And doing so recognizes that there are all these different kinds of Orientalism, right? There's like French Orientalism, there's Anglo or Spanish Orientalism, and they get practiced in different ways. Their imagination of who the other is very different, right? Because of how the colonial world is being divided up and which places are where. But for me, what I was interested in was how is Orientalism practiced by non-imperial powers? Or how is Orientalism practiced by non-whites? Right? Because that also, there's a similar function there for defining oneself through the other, right? But it doesn't involve the deployment of an armada or like the construction of a navy, right? Because of the place in the periphery, right? And so, you know, that to me is also like a methodological point to make about studying Orientalism in these other spaces. And so it's also a new mode of accounting for power, and to try to think about that it's not just that we can identify places that also non-white places that also despised Asians, right? But that
Yes.
there are these different conditions that give Orientalism power.
So I want to. So this leads
Yeah.
actually directly into the next question,
Yeah.
related to Mexico as a racial state. So of
Yeah.
course, prior to reading Chino, I think a lot of people made an assumption that Mexico was in part borrowing their racist state practices from the United States, most notably the 1882 Exclusion Act.
Right.
And of course, the 1882 Exclusion Act in the United States was a driving factor in Chinese immigration to Mexico, but maybe in ways that I had not fully understood
Right,
until reading your book. So can you talk about how you came to think about Mexico as its own racial state, and then the role of empire, which I think your book really complicates how to think about a colonial project and empire.
Yeah. So the concept of the racial state hasn't really been used to understand Mexico. Mostly it's been, post-colonial theory has been used to understand this transformation of this process of transformation from a colony to a homeland, as Benedict Anderson describes in Imagined Communities. But for me, what I found useful about the concept of the racial state is it allowed me to think through how this 19th century republic was dealing with its colonial inheritance in combination with its these devastating crises and struggling for legitimacy. And so the racial state, trying to identify what ideologies of racial dominance were at work in these different phases of Mexican history, helped to cut through a mythology in Mexico that it's not a racist place, right? Because it's majority non-white, it has a history of racial mixture, and does not possess Jim Crow style laws, right? And so there's a real seduction to project the power of U.S. empire wherever we see racism, to think that this is a clear indication that power is at work in other places, right? And so, but for me, what I was finding in the archive were stories about how anti-Chinese politics resonated with local concerns. And the interesting thing is, there were places where no Chinese resided, and they were still passing anti-Chinese laws. They were still protesting the presence of. So that tells me has very little to do with the numbers, right? It's the political function of that racism.
Wait, this is like places in the U.S. passing anti-Sharia law.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right, they don't have to be there.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in deconstructing the architecture of the Mexican racial state, I had to contend with the reach of U.S. empire, right? To think that if at every turn I am trying to find the origins or the influence of racism from the United States, then I won't see how Mexicans were trying to make sense of their own political situations, right? And even if those responses were to spill blood, to expel these immigrants, to kick them out of the state. And so, it's easy to find evidence of racial discourse in the archive. And you can go anywhere and you will find it. But the trick is to find out is to interpret it through its historical circumstances, right? And so I think for me, empire was both a concern as well as a kind of warning. It was a kind of reminder to always look for, if I wasn't finding the local actors, right, to find new ways of bringing that significance back into the story.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have two more questions, and then
Cool.
want to let people know we're nearing the end. Okay, so Chino provides this really rich cross-ethnic, cross-racial comparative lens. Can you talk more about how anti-Chinese and anti-Indigenous sentiments, discourse, laws kind of work together, especially in terms of the rise of this national Mestizo identity?
Yeah. So for me, as an ethnic studies scholar, it's always important for me to think about race as kind of like a constellation and not necessarily as a singularity. And so studying racism can take a lot of different forms, a lot of different analytical approaches. On the one hand, you could look at the population that's being targeted and look at the impact, that the adaptation that results because of that targeting. You could look at the perpetrating group and what problem does the racism seek to solve. Right? That's one way that you could approach it. Another way is to think about buffer groups that insulate core groups from the influence of other lower groups. And as a way of sort of getting at a larger intergroup dynamic that you wouldn't necessarily see just by looking at a singular group. So, this understanding, this idea of the constellation, a racial constellation, helps to build in the importance of non-white race relations, right? So the relationship between different groups, different non-white groups, but also different kinds of whiteness being practiced. And so in Mexico, the anti-Indian sentiment was always a part of that colonial inheritance. You know, in the 19th century, there were all kinds of proposals to exterminate the indigenous population, make space for a European settler population. That was the desired goal for decades. And the impossibility of that project led them to think about the importation of Africans, of Asians, to jumpstart their industrial infrastructure, right? That would then maybe bring in these other more desirable European immigrants, and having to contend with the legacy of that, the place of Indians in the Mexican state, was amplified during Reconstruction, because this was a time when Mexico had rewritten its constitution to be the first constitution to identify social rights, right? Which is that it's not liberal rights to individual acts, but you have social rights to land, social rights to education and healthcare, and that was a different kind of relationship to the state, right? So in this way, the state gained its authority and legitimacy by protecting the poor, right? By protecting the Indians. And so in a weird way, it was as if, the failed project of modernization during the 19th century was sort of won over during Reconstruction because it invited the participation of the mass population into the project of industrial agriculture. And so therefore, kind of winning this war of legitimacy that the Mexican state struggled with. And Mestizo nationalism was the most successful solution to the perennial instability of the Mexican state, because it provided a mechanism for inclusion that wasn't otherwise available. Anti-Chinismo made that transition palatable.
And of course, being Chinese wasn't part of, so for those of you who may not speak Spanish or may not know about Mexico, mestizo refers to mixed, it refers to this idea of a mixed identity comprised of a kind of white European, specifically Spanish, kind of descent, along with indigenous population.
Right.
That's mestizo, but not Chinese mixed in with that.
Right.
And to a certain degree, African Mexicans are part of that.
Right.
To a certain degree.
Yes. Yeah. There's a colonial caste system that is developed during Spanish rule, and and it's based on hypo and hyper descent. So the different kinds of interracial marriages or unions would produce different kinds of racial outcomes that were hierarchically organized, right? So an index of racial type. And one could marry up, one could marry down, one could purchase one's a higher caste, and a religious process called limpia de sangre. You clean your blood through paying the church. Yeah. But there were all these variations, and so there were avenues for incorporation of an African population. But the place for Chinese was at the very bottom in the colonial caste system, and the combination of indigenous and Asian was lower than Indian, and so it didn't figure into the colonial rubric, and some of that stays on. But the real power of anti-Chinese politics in the construction of mestizaje in the 1920s and 30s was that it was anti-Chinese politics was a message to Mexican women. It was a message to them to control your sexuality, right? Practice your sexuality in a patriotic way, right? And that was a way to mobilize gender identity and national identity through the use of this imagined other, right? So
This is why intersectionality is so important, because you never only have nationalism.
Right.
You're always going to be imbricated in questions of class and race and gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final question, because we have so many undergraduate students in the audience, many of whom are in my Asian American and the U.S. South class, so thank you, audience members who are my students. There's been a concerted effort on behalf of a lot of Asian American student activists, some of whom you met over lunch, to convince the senior leadership at UNC-Chapel Hill, none of whom I think are here, unfortunately, but we have this taped, so maybe we will show them this portion of the clip, to convince senior leaders why there should be an Asian American historian here. So currently we have two faculty members, myself and Dr. Heidi Kim in English, and then Dr. Joe in Asian Studies has some related diaspora Korean interests.
Right.
Although she really is trained in more Asian studies. But we have no historian.
Right.
And you are a historian who's trained as a comparative ethnic scholar, as an Asian Americanist. What would you say an Asian American historian would have to add to these kinds of conversations?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, on the one hand, I have an unorthodox relationship to disciplinarity. As on the one hand, as a PhD in ethnic studies, in many ways, to study race is to challenge the legacy of our disciplines, and in history, the effect of racism has been silencing, and erasure, and so, thinking about if it's true that Asian American history doesn't need to be written by a specialist, then why, in Asian American studies, why are all of the Asian American history books in the library written after 1970? Written by scholars who have studied this question, right? So in a way, it's, I feel like there's, the capaciousness of the discipline is sort of a false promise of being recognized, right? Which is also not to, it also doesn't recognize how the field of Asian American Studies has developed its own intellectual project and its own training, its own methodologies, right? The idea of tracing the political function of Asian racial difference has been a project of key historians in Asian American Studies, from the founding, right? To think about different ways and different narratives that we can trace through archival evidence the impact of American Orientalism is a really powerful kind of empirical form of evidence, right? To rationalize and justify the field, right? That these aren't records that have all of a sudden been released and that have been hidden from view. These are things that historians have neglected to account for, right? Because they don't confirm, they don't affirm, a nationalist expectation about what U.S. history is, right? So Asian Americans, that's the stated goal of Asian American studies. And as a historian, one of the things that I kind of use as my rubric in guiding graduate students is to ask them to think about their project in terms of, are you confirming a thesis or an idea that someone else has made of another place or another time period, or are you changing the way we understand the past? And I think that's an important function of historians, is to alter our understanding of the past. And we do that through the examination of evidence, archival research, right? And the combination of these interpretive traditions, right? Based on critical theory from around the world to the development of new theories, right? So while Asian American historians have been at the sort of the vanguard of the field, the theoretical innovations have come from English, right?
Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interdisciplinary field,
Yeah.
right? And so, for instance, like Candace Chu's idea that to study Asian America is to look at a subjectless discourse, right? That in some ways we don't, like the case of Tlaxcala that had no Chinese residents in it, but yet they were still passing anti-Chinese, anti-miscegenation laws, right? The numbers don't have to be there. It's the idea, the difference is there, and that's the thing to pay attention to. And so if historians, if more conventional sort of social historians are looking for the presence, the physical presence, they're going to miss an entire other echelon of human activity directed at influencing the lives of Asian Americans, right? So, that's sort of like one thing. The other is that Asian American history, its current trends now are sort of global in scope. To think that Asian American history is like a parochial concern of minority ethnic communities is just outdated. That form of writing ethnic history is I just don't see people doing that kind of work. The work that historians in Asian American studies are working on rethinking the global dimensions of diaspora, looking at community formation among refugees. The Asian American studies, through the thrust of transnationalism, have opened up a number of inquiries into these other places. So like my book on Mexico is just one example, I think, of a larger kind of movement to think outside of the United States and also to think of the unconventional connections, right? For instance, I was just at this conference in Princeton where Ichiro Zuma has just finished a new book on Japanese American migration. And one of the things that he's highlighting there is that the Japanese Americans that left before World War II left because they wanted to participate in a racial state free of white supremacy. And so they went to Manchuria. They went to other places in the other places in the Japanese Empire, right? And so if our lens is only of those Asian immigrants who stayed, we're going to miss an entire dynamic, right? And a way of looking at Asian American populations that aren't just bound by these kind of very strict definitions about residency and legal status, because those shift all the time, right? And are subject to all kinds of different interpretations and on-the-ground realities. So I think, the real face of Asian American history is that it's a global project, right? It's engaged in multiple languages, and it's trying to change the way we think about the past.
Great.
So,
All right.
yeah.
Let's open it up for questions. Anyone have a question for Jason or Dr. Chang? Do you prefer Jason or Dr.
Jason,
Chang?
Jason, please.
Okay. Don't be shy. Or a comment. You can just tell us a comment. Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Jason. I can't wait to read your book. I'm wondering, what parts of Mexico are you working on specifically, and how do you deal with these different scenarios and these ambiguities in one coherent book?
Yeah. So, let's see. Well, what I tried to do was I tried to follow the source material, and the archive is incomplete. And where I had hoped to find evidence of Chinese communities or the agitators working to expel them, I couldn't. So in some ways, what I focused on was what I was able to find, not an empirical sort of illustration of what was actually on the ground. And so the majority of the Chinese population was in the north, and that's where the anti-Chinese campaigns began. And so because I was interested in the ideological image, the figure of the Chinese, I was able to identify key players. And what I did is I followed their careers. So for instance, I would follow state legislators who were trying to pass anti-Chinese ordinances and laws in their states. And then what did they do as their careers developed, right? Some of them eventually end up in the Partido Nacional Revolucionario, the key political party of Mexico, and become architects of Reconstruction, right? So in some ways, what I was doing was I was trying to follow the evolution of, I was trying to watch how they learned about anti-Chinismo, right? It gave them a way of defining their moral authority to the state in ways that were different than their competitors, right? Their competitors were saying, either I'm the military general in charge of this area, or I'm the industrialist that can bring this area under development, right? But anti-Chinistas were the ones that were saying, I'm here for the public good, right? And that was an altogether different kind of rationality. And that ultimately won many political arguments. And so by following their careers and following the different places, I could trace how the origins of the campaign began in the north, migrated to Mexico City, and then became institutionalized, and then went back out to other states. And so thanks to archives of state legislatures, I was able to track down the interstate movement of the anti-Chinese campaigns, and also to see how federal laws were then interpreted by states, because that was also an uneven process, right? I actually have a couple images of, so these are some of the anti-Chinese organizations and their racist letterhead.
Yeah, that's pretty racist, having anti-Chino right up there.
But a colleague of mine found in the archives that of the PNR, the first political party of the revolutionary state, that their letterhead was printed on the back of the unused anti-Chinista letterhead. Right. So the first PNR headquarters was of the Liga Pro Raza in in Mexico City, which is an anti-Chinese organization. So the overlaps between these two led me to make these surprising connections, right? And things that have been overlooked by historians of Mexico for several decades. So that's sort of one example. And this is an image of anti-Chinese rallies in the north. And so one way that we could think about this is that while you have legislators trying to pass anti-Chinese ordinances, right, in a way they're speaking to their constituency and say, we're going to protect you from these people. But we're not going to pass land reform, right? We're not going to build new irrigation infrastructure, but we'll protect you from these people. And then you have these kinds of protests against the presence of the Chinese, which in some ways is a way of speaking up to your political representative, to the jefe politico, and claiming a new form of citizenship. Before the revolution, no one would have cared what these people were saying. So they're claiming a new form of belonging to Mexico that didn't exist before. They're doing it through anti-Chinese politics. Right?
Was there any counter protest to this? Anyone who saw this and thought this is we're having all of this. This is a non-issue. I mean, my understanding is that this is a non-issue.
Yeah. Well, so the courts were divided. The Mexican courts were divided. They found they decided in the favor of Chinese, but before I kind of like praise the courts, they're kind of also protecting what was left of the rule of law, but also the economic function that the Chinese served during this fragile state of Mexican development. So in a way, the courts counteracted some of that. The Chinese organizations also published their own sort of counter pamphlets, which basically argued that they're just as nationalist as the Mexicans, and that they're going to help Mexico develop. It's the economic contributions part as a main thread in their sort of rationale for justification for their presence. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Jason, in your archival work, did you come across any strategies for the good Mexicans who wanted to vote out the leaders that were leading these racist, xenophobic campaigns and were able to organize and defeat those forces?
So there were a couple other strong factions that were also vying for power. They weren't really sympathetic to the Chinese. The one exception would be the Labor Party of Mexico in the north, which was an anarchist organization, and they at first in like 1910s they were anti-Chinese. By the 1920s, they evolved to have a more conciliatory approach, to see that I think what they recognized was the political value of anti-Chinese politics, and that was overshadowing their own ambitions, and that aligning with the Chinese community in the U.S.-Mexico border area was a way of redefining a political opposition to that. Unsuccessful and in claiming power, and they also had to contend with the violence of the state, right? So they're in contesting state authority. They also became subject to their own targeting by the state.
Michael?
I haven't read the book, so you may have well covered this in the book.
Oh, sure.
I'm a little curious about the portrayal of Chinese
Uh-huh.
by the Mexican in this period.
Yeah.
In particular, do they follow the familiar colonial trope of, let's say, the Chinese being uncivilized,
Yeah.
untrustworthy,
Uh-huh.
unhygienic,
Yes.
or things like that? Or do they have a different set of rhetoric and logic?
Mm-hmm.
Because you keep
Yeah.
suggesting that you almost have a somewhat functionalist
Uh-huh.
analysis of,
Yeah.
of this serve the Mexican state.
Yes.
This serves the
Yeah.
political elite of the Mexican state.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about in terms of the rhetoric
Yeah.
and the depiction. Do they have also have a different set of logic, different set of rhetoric, or do they just quite fall in the familiar colonial
Yeah.
trope, shall we say?
Yeah, yeah. Now, you can find very similar, representations of Chinese, from like the disease-ridden immigrant population to the kind of coolie stereotype. They're just workers. But I have one image of, this is an image depicting the process of good race mixing and bad race mixing.
Huh.
And this is where I see a differentiation, right? I see where Mexicans are taking these globally circulated ideas of the colonial stereotype and sort of domesticating them within the political project of Reconstruction in the 1920s and 30s, right? And so this image over here is the translation is a product of the mixing of Chinese and Mexican, age 14, and this is a mix of Indo-Latino of 12 years old. And I don't know which one is more ridiculous, but so the image, the Chinese mestizo is indoors, frail, not very robust, disfigured. For some reason, I'm always drawn to the socks in both of these pictures. Like the socks are falling down. He has robust argyle socks. But this Boy Scout figure is a far cry from the sombrero, bolero-clad, Pancho Villa type ideal of the Mexican peasant, right? How is any Mexican going to be persuaded by this, right?
Look at the pine trees, too.
Yeah, the pine trees. And, the sort of ascot and this is crazy. It's crazy. So I connect this with, and this isn't in the book, so you guys are getting bonus material. This is from the Mexican Boy Scouts, Exploradores. And this is a manual written by one of the lead enthusiasts of the Boy Scouts. And so this is the cover here. It says, "Light, more light to drive out the darkness." He's all about Spanish literacy in indigenous communities, right? And then over here, this is the back matter of the book, right? We have the image of a peasant campesino sitting down, reading text. And then we also have the image of an industrial worker, overalls, cap, facing him, right? And the implication here is that through curriculum, through education, you can transform an Indian farmer into a mestizo worker in one generation, right? And so that, to me, connects with this idea, right? That good mixing is going to lead in this direction. But this is mixing at the behest of the state, right? Through the guidance of the educational system, right? And so those connections, I think, are like working together to transform a globally circulated idea of, say, the colonial stereotype into a kind of local thing that has value, right? That can help them articulate a certain power dynamic, right?
We have time for probably one more question. Did someone else have a question too? Okay.
I'm a first-year undergraduate student here at UNC-Chapel, and I was curious as to what advice you would give undergraduate students here and at other universities who are interested specifically in studying Asian American history content, yet are not being provided the resources by the university. Like, what avenues would you recommend for students such as myself or other students who perhaps are in a similar situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Asian American Studies has always been connected to student life. The origins of ethnic studies came from student protests. Asian American Studies at UConn has come from demands of students. And so connecting, in one sense, finding Asian American Studies is about connecting to the institution and the social life of the campus. And on the other hand, so it's kind of like two things, like working down and also working up, right? To find allies and to find other resources to demonstrate that that this is it's not like a hobby, right? That this is serious intellectual concern, right? And that this is I think someone was telling me about the reading group. There's an Asian American Studies reading group.
Working group. So there's an
group.
Asian American Studies working group.
Working group. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, thank you. So that's one way of illustrating that these questions can animate an intellectual community, right? And I think by demonstrating that that it goes beyond, say, a need to serve an Asian American population, right? The university should value Asian American Studies because of its intellectual contributions. The rationale shouldn't be that this is to serve Asian Americans. Everyone should know about Asian American Studies, right? And so, I think it has its own value beyond just its promotion and recognition of Asian American communities, right? So I think that intellectual question can drive a lot of new kinds of arguments for the inclusion of Asian American history. One of the things that I've seen done in other universities is to trace the ways that the university community has been involved in episodes of U.S. Orientalism or early ways, the early participation of Asian Americans in campus, and that kind of serves as a different kind of anchor, right? That this isn't a new request, right? Or this isn't addressing a new problem, but a recognition that there's been a long presence that's gone unrecognized, right? And that's another kind of rationality, justification. But it's also a historical inquiry, right? Again, presenting that sort of empirical evidence that kind of shifts the discussion away from whether this is like a political concession or a cultural recognition, right? This is a university dedicated to excellence, right? If you want excellence, you have to have diversity, right? And so by doing those things, by demonstrating what that looks like, you can show these different rationales for creating those kinds of spaces and faculty lines.
Thank you.
Faculty lines. All right, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to